The disenfranchisement of Washingtonians is one of the remaining glaring civil rights and voting rights issues of our time.
Washington, D.C. renews its fight to become the 51st state in the Union as hopes grow that the Democratic leadership in Congress could deliver representation to the nation's capital. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. Momentum is growing in the nation's capital to make Washington, D.C., or District of Columbia, the 51st state of the United States of America. After the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol and nationwide protests against police brutality last summer, Democrats in Congress have made the question of Washington, D.C.'s statehood a top racial justice and voting rights priority. The White House confirmed President Joe Biden's support to grant the district's over 700,000 residents full autonomy over its laws and budget.
He believes they deserve representation. That's why he supports D.C. statehood.
D.C. residents who outnumber those in states like Vermont or Wyoming pay more federal taxes per capita than anywhere in the United States. They serve in the military and on juries, but do not have any representatives with voting power in the U.S. Congress. The House Committee on Oversight and Reform held a hearing this week to consider H.R. 51, a bill that proposes shrinking the federal enclave to a 2-mile radius to include the White House, congressional buildings, the National Mall, and the Supreme Court. It would turn the rest of the district into a state. Eleanor Holmes Norton, the district's non-voting delegate in Congress who introduced the bill, says giving Washingtonians, the majority of whom are people of color, 2 senators and House members with voting power, like every other state, is a racial justice issue.
Congress has 2 choices. It can continue to exercise undemocratic, autocratic control over the American citizens who reside in our nation's capital, treating them, in the words of Frederick Douglass, as aliens, not citizens, but subjects. Or it can live up to this nation's promise and ideals, end taxation without representation, and pass H.R. 51.
It will be an uphill battle to strip control over the district from Congress, with many still claiming D.C. statehood is unconstitutional.
The Democrats are not serious. Instead, they're setting aside the Constitution in order to give progressives a quick win so they can achieve their goals of defunding the police and enacting a new Green Deal.
In a historic vote last summer, Holmes Norton's statehood bill passed the House, mostly along party lines, but it died in the Republican-led Senate. Her revived bill has enough support to pass the Democratic majority House, but will likely face roadblocks in a divided Senate. 60 votes are needed instead of a simple majority of 51 votes because of the filibuster, a parliamentary procedure that effectively requires 60 out of 100 Senate votes for most legislation to pass. Some in Congress are calling for the filibuster to be reformed or eliminated. So, with the current hurdles in the U.S. Senate, can D.C. become a state? The last time the U.S. admitted a new member was in 1959, when Hawaii became the 50th state to join the Union. So what are the chances that D.C. could become the 51st? Joining me now to discuss D.C.'s long fight for statehood is one of America's civil rights leaders, the Rev Jesse Jackson. He's a former Democratic presidential candidate. He served as the first shadow U.S. Senator for the District of Columbia from 1991 to 1997. Reverend Jackson, it's great to see you. I know you have been for many decades at the forefront of efforts to lobby Congress to grant D.C. full voting representation through statehood. The non-voting D.C. delegate in Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, says that today there's never been a time when statehood for D.C. was more likely. Is that how you see it, or is it still an uphill battle?
Well, we began the fight in the 90s at another level with the visit of every senator, every congressperson, and we should do it now. More people live in D.C. than live in Vermont or Wyoming. More people that pay more taxes in like 4 or 5 states. So taxes and people's desire should be enough to get statehood. Congress has exclusive authority over D.C. and have the ability to move right now to make it happen.
But are things moving fast enough to make it happen? You said this in the early 1990s about giving D.C. residents full representation.
If we can fight for self-determination in Lithuania and Poland and Czechoslovakia and Panama and Nicaragua, we must not leave the people who live here out of that equation. We too have the right of representation on that hill.
Does it surprise you that in 2021, the United States, which is often referred to as the world's beacon of democracy, still denies the people of its capital city full voting representation? And will that change?
You know, in Havana, Cuba, Moscow, Russia, Paris, France, London, all of these capitals, the capital city is enfranchised. We're behind the ball on that. And we deserve representation. There's a big vote. Do you want it? 86% said yes. People really want statehood. Morally right, economically sound, legally possible, and constitutionally possible. So it should happen at every conceivable level.
What do you think is holding this up?
Race. Assumption they say DC is too small, too liberal, too black, too urban, too democratic. That's holding it up. But that shouldn't hold it up. Because someone's black doesn't mean they should be disenfranchised. Because somebody's urban doesn't mean they should be disenfranchised. As a matter of fact, Virginia and Maryland, took territory from the district some years ago. But the people there have a right to be represented in the Congress with the vote.
You say, Reverend, that race is what is driving this. In the 1990s, when the push for DC statehood failed, you were in Congress, having been elected as DC shadow senator in 1990. Back then, some members of Congress openly spoke against DC becoming a state in what were racially charged comments that raised a few eyebrows at the time.
The district's hug-a-thug attitude on violent crime and the continued misuse of the city's department is just one example that clearly demonstrates the fact that the district is not a state and shouldn't be considered for statehood.
How much did race and racism motivate the opposition to DC back then? How much does it drive the debate now? Because it wasn't just Republicans opposed to this question. Back in 1993, when a bill was voted on, 105 Democrats voted against it.
Well, the fact of the matter is that today's Republicans are yesterday's Democrats. So that's not a measure either. The measure should be you have enough people who say yes, they want it, statehood. Can they afford it? Can they have a tax base? We pay more taxes in 5 states. More people than Vermont and Wyoming. More people. In Vermont and Wyoming, they have 4 U.S. senators. These states that have 1 voting senator. It's not fair.
Reverend, as you know, a major hurdle right now is the filibuster, a procedural maneuver in the Senate that effectively requires 60 votes to close debate on a bill and force a vote on the floor. Can DC ever become a state if the filibuster isn't eliminated? Can it ever get 60 senators to vote yes?
It would be more difficult, and yet it's a challenge. We accept that challenge. We hope that it should be 51 as opposed to 60. But if we're just 9 votes short, we're closer than we've ever been before. People in Washington deserve representation in the Congress. After all, taxation without representation, pay more taxes in 5 states, more soldiers in 25 states in the Vietnam War, more people than Vermont and Wyoming. Enough people, enough taxes, enough soldiers. The citizens should be respected.
And as many people point out, the filibuster is a relic of the civil rights era. It was used time and again to block votes on civil rights. Do you believe that it's time for it to be removed altogether? Because President Biden says he's open to reforming it, to keeping the talking filibuster, but not to removing it altogether.
Well, the fact of the matter is that 51 votes is the majority. And there are enough people. For example, you have 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, right? 50-50. The Democrats represent 41 million more people. I mean, two senators from Wyoming, 2 from California, a tenth of the nation. So there's all kind of accommodations been made down through the years. Why not enfranchise our capital? I mean, Havana is enfranchised. Poland, France, London, Britain, should I say. Why not DC?
And as you say, many people for years have questioned how democratic and how representative the Senate is. As you say, 2 senators assigned to each state, however small or large their populations are. There's also the issue that in its 232-year history, the Senate has only had 11 Black senators. Is that lack of representation something that concerns you?
Well, it does concern me. Matter of fact, when Alaska and Hawaii came in, they expected there would be one way and another in terms of representation. You can't guarantee who will be senator, but you have the right to choose your senator. I mean, taxes is a factor in that. I think military service is a factor in that. Number of people is a factor in that. You never have people run the government? That's a factor in that. People desire it, that's another factor. So we have enough factors. We're morally right, and we are rationally sound, and we're economically sound, legally possible. So let's do it.
Finally, Reverend, as a longtime civil rights activist and a leader of the civil rights movement, how do you see the fight for racial justice in America today?
Well, it's very tenuous. We're Blacks work the hardest, make the least amount of money, the most gaps in healthcare, education, and jobs. A whole lot from slavery, 246 years of legal slavery. I got involved with ASUS in 1960, 60 years ago. Been a long-term battle I've been engaged in, and I'm satisfied that we're making progress. And more whites are voting for Blacks, I might add. A lot of Blacks that represent the majority of white districts, which means that whites are becoming more civil in terms of voting. I see changes in the air. Hope is in the air, and the help is on the way. All
right. On this note, we'll have to leave it there. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And for more on this, I'm joined by the current shadow U.S. Senator for Washington, D.C., Paul Strauss. He succeeded Jesse Jackson in '97 as a non-voting representative for D.C. residents. Senator Strauss, you've been lobbying Congress for many years over this issue. In fact, since the late 90s, when D.C. statehood was just a pipe dream, a goal of the political fringe. Do you believe that D.C. statehood is now finally within reach, that it is now a top priority for the Democratic Party?
Well, I hope so. D.C. statehood was never a fringe issue to the people of Washington, D.C. And for us, it's not about advancing the interests of one party or another. It's about securing the democratic rights that we don't have, but that other Americans do. And so we've always taken it seriously here. But I'm glad we're getting the national attention around the country because the situation has just become untenable.
But that's not how Republican leaders see it. They're mobilizing against the statehood push. They're calling it a partisan power grab. Will you have to change the Senate rules to allow for a simple majority vote if this is going to go anywhere?
Well, it's possible. First of all, this isn't a power grab. The power grab occurred when D.C. residents lost all their political power hundreds of years ago and lacked the democratic rights that everybody else. So it's crazy that in Washington, D.C., the citizens of the capital city don't have the same rights as other Americans. That was the power grab. This is a correction and a restoration of rights that should have never been taken away. Under the Senate rules, the bill only needs 51 votes to pass. But of course, procedurally, in order for the vote to be called, you technically need 60 votes to end debate. Now, I think there's a good argument for exempting statehood from the filibuster, whether you abolish it or not, because the men who wrote our Constitution, when they decided the number of votes needed to admit new states in Congress, they set the number at simple majority and not supermajority. So I think...
But the reality is that now most legislation requires 60 votes in the Senate. You mentioned earlier that this has never been a fringe issue for DC residents. They want, the vast majority of the residents of the district want to see DC become a state. DC license plates, in fact, have long had that slogan, taxation without representation. Will that change anytime soon if most of the country, let's face it, doesn't really know or care about this issue?
Well, I think more and more people are learning about the issue and more people are caring about the issue. votes under the current rule, but you can change that rule with only 51 votes. So it's not a political impossibility. It just requires some political will.
Many Democrats will often say that Republicans stand in the way of legislation like this. But have Democrats played it right? Haven't they also been guilty of playing partisan politics and using this issue as political retribution?
No, we're not political retribution. We're Americans who want equality. So the campaign by Republicans to paint us as some kind of fringe extremist group is just wrong. We're regular people who live in Washington, D.C. We have nothing to do with the federal government for the most part. That's a separate section. So under statehood, the federal district will continue as a federal district. But the part that contains my house, the schools, the office buildings, the hospitals, that becomes admitted as the 53rd state. And so many people live there that our population is already going to be greater than some of the existing states. So we need to stop the idea that equality for Americans is any kind of retribution. What it is fundamental fairness. What it is the right thing to do. And I think the majority of the American people, when they learn about this issue, and we appreciate you helping get our story out around the world, will come to understand that giving democracy to the citizens of a democratic nation, giving equality to all Americans who are citizens, is absolutely the right thing to do, not just for the people of Washington, D.C., but for America as a whole.
Your predecessor as D.C. Shadow Senator Jesse Jackson just told us that race is what is driving key opposition to D.C. statehood. Do you believe that that is the case?
Race has always been a fundamental problem in getting equality for the Washington, D.C. residents. Race continues to be a problem in enfranchising our territories. Washington, D.C., which is predominantly black, Puerto Rico, which is Latino, Guam, which is Asian Pacific Islander, the Virgin Islands, all of these territories that have majority non-white populations don't have equality. It's a terrible shame of our country that we still let race determine your political status, and it's past the time in the 21st century to correct that problem.
Senator Paul Strauss, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
For many generations, DC residents have been advocating for statehood. The modern fight over the district's lack of representation began during the Civil Rights era in the late 1950s, when the Black population in Washington, D.C. was growing. By 1970, 70% of the district was Black. Now, the African American population in what was once known as the Chocolate City is just under 50%, but people of color remain the majority. If D.C. is granted statehood, it would be the only state in the United States where African Americans account for the largest racial group. Today, the D.C. statehood bill in the House has near unanimous support from Democrats, but no support among Republicans. While Congress continues to squabble over the constitutionality and political implications of D.C. statehood, the overwhelming majority of those living in the district are in favor of D.C. becoming a state. In a 2016 referendum, 86% of D.C. residents voted in favor. So why are Republican lawmakers opposed to allowing the district to govern itself? Republican Congresswoman Kat Cammack of Florida joins me now. Congresswoman Cammack, you don't believe the District of Columbia should be a state. Why not? Why shouldn't DC residents have full voting rights, just like the residents of your district or any other district in the United States?
Well, you know, the founding fathers, they never intended for our nation's capital to become a center of power, not just for really the country, but the world, and then have it be a position where we had two senators and representatives that had a voice in the House, because obviously that is an unfair advantage, right? So the District of Columbia.
Why is it an unfair advantage? Isn't it an unfair disadvantage for the 7,000 residents, 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia to pay full taxes and have no voting member of Congress?
When you have 435 members of Congress really working to control the purse strings, and you're in a city that benefits from those purse strings in a way where they have representation, and you have all of these members of Congress in your district, that is a tremendous amount of influence over these members. I would advocate the same if the capital was elsewhere.
But would you really? I mean, isn't this about how democracy works?
So,
I mean, the Constitution isn't really the obstacle to DC statehood. You know that.
but if
It's
we're,
about political power and which party controls the US Congress, isn't it, at the end of the day?
the thing that is curious to me is if we're truly a constitutional republic, why are we doing everything that we can to subvert the intentions and will of our founding fathers? They never wanted our nation's capital to be recognized as a formal state because of the sphere of influence that it would have over the members of Congress that currently work there. And when
But hold on, though, Congresswoman. I mean, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that DC cannot become a state. The Constitution does mandate a federal district to serve as the seat of government, yes. It decrees a maximum size, in fact, 10 miles square, not a minimum size. And today it's the entire city of DC. The new bill, in fact, would shrink the federal enclave to include the White House, Congress, a few federal buildings. The remaining land would become a state. Why wouldn't that be constitutional?
There is absolutely an intention that was made when you read the Federalist Papers, when you read the intention of our founding fathers. DC was never intended to become a state. And that is a fact. And when
but this is not law. When you say the intentions of your the nation's founding fathers, hold on. But this could be an intention, but we're talking about the law. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to admit new states through simple legislation, doesn't it?
Is that if you're a constitutional republic and you believe that we have a constitutional republic, then you want to make sure that you are following through with the intent and spirit of how the founding fathers envisioned statehood, or lack thereof, for our nation's capital. The fact of the matter is that of course Democrats would love to have DC become a state because that's 2 more senators, and they would get representatives that would clearly benefit them in the political process. There's nothing policy oriented about this. This is pure politics through and through. This has been a discussion for years. It will continue to be a discussion in the future. But that's
so you are admitting, Congresswoman, though, that this is all about partisanship. You are admitting that Republicans are nervous about DC becoming a state because it would mean 2 additional Democratic members of the Senate. Is that what it's about?
This is why the Democrats are pushing for this.
But yes or no? Is that what you are worried about?
I'm going to give you a yes or no answer. Again, the Democrats have continually pushed for this because typically urban centers become Democratic strongholds, just like New York City, Chicago, LA. This would be no different. They have no desire for statehood other than they would gain additional seats in the Senate and they would gain additional seats in the House. That is a fact. When you look at Puerto Rico, there is a dynamic that they're less sure about because they have a Republican representative in Puerto Rico. But nevertheless, the means by which the House has been pushing for this have been attached to riders that have nothing to do with statehood through and through. There was an attempt through H.R. 1 just last year in the 116th Congress to include statehood in the H.R. 1 bill. This year, it wasn't ruled germane. So now they're looking at different vehicles that they can tuck this language into so that it's not actually about this issue purely through and through as a policy position. This is a pure political power play by Nancy Pelosi and the left to ensure that they win future elections. That's what this.
And this is, Congresswoman, looking on the flip side, this is all about Republicans trying to deny Democrats more seats in the Congress. Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate, in fact, admitted this. He said in September, and I quote him, "Here's what Democrats will do after they change the filibuster. They're going to admit the District of Columbia as a state. They will admit Puerto Rico as a state. That's 4 new Democratic senators in perpetuity." Isn't that what it's all about? Not wanting Democrats to have more seats in the House and in the Senate.
No, that's, again, you have Democrats that are literally pushing this for political reasons. And you're suggesting that Republicans are denying it for political reasons, not for the fact that our founding fathers never envisioned a seat of our nation's capital to have representation when they have 435 members who travel there on a regular basis and have that seat of power there.
It's Congresswoman Kat Cammack, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
It is difficult to dissociate the question of statehood for Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, or other U.S. territories From the race and ethnicity question, particularly in the aftermath of an anti-racism movement that spread throughout the United States following the murder of George Floyd by police last summer, it is even more difficult to dissociate that question from the very foundation of representative democracy. Republicans, in their majority, oppose the idea of new states on constitutional grounds, but probably more so on partisan ones. The electoral calculus is not to their advantage. And so, in short, 2021 could well be a pivotal year when almost 4 million disenfranchised Americans, Washingtonians, and Puerto Ricans could see their rights granted as full-fledged Americans. And if this does happen, abolishing second-class citizenship for those millions of Americans could well become President Biden's most important legacy. Send us your thoughts and comments. For me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the entire team in Washington, thanks for watching.